Welcome, fellow seekers of history's shadows, to a journey deep into the heart of medieval Europe, a world where faith and fear were two sides of the same coin, where the promise of salvation cast a shadow far darker than you might imagine. Picture a towering monastery, its spires piercing a stormy sky, its bells tolling like a call to the divine. These were the sacred sanctuaries of the Middle Ages, places we've been told were havens of learning, charity, and divine light. But what if I told you that behind those stone walls, in the silence between prayers, a different story unfolded? A story of corruption, betrayal, and horrors that would chill even the most cynical soul. Before we step into those shadowed corridors, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Are you settling in for a quiet evening in London, gazing at the stars in Sydney, or stealing a moment somewhere else entirely? Drop your location in the comments below, and let's embark on this journey into the past together. If you're as fascinated by history's hidden truths as I am, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a descent into the darkness. To understand the monasteries, we must first step into the world that shaped them. Close your eyes and imagine medieval Europe, a land where death was a constant companion. Famine could erase entire villages in a single season. The Great Famine of 1315 left millions starving, their bodies wasting as crops rotted in sodden fields. Plague swept through towns, claiming lives with merciless speed. The Black Death would later kill a third of Europe's population in mere years. Life was brutal, short, and steeped in suffering. A peasant might live to 30, if fortunate, their days haunted by hunger, disease, or the fear of a vengeful God's judgment. Into this desperate world stepped the Catholic Church, the most powerful force of the age. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a political and economic colossus. By the 13th century, the Church owned vast estates, some larger than entire kingdoms. It commanded armies, swayed kings, and held the power of life and death over millions of souls. Its monasteries and abbeys, scattered across Europe like stars in a constellation, were the beating heart of this empire of faith. These were the places where, we're told, holy men and women devoted their lives to prayer, study, and service to God. They copied ancient texts, preserving the words of Plato and Augustine. They tended the sick, offering herbs and prayers to the afflicted. They gave shelter to weary travelers, a bed and a bowl of pottage for a whispered blessing. But what if that image is a facade? What if those soaring arches and sacred vows concealed a reality far more sinister? Tonight, we are not just exploring the story of medieval monasteries, we are tearing away the myths to reveal what life was really like within those stone walls. These so-called sanctuaries were often places where ambition masqueraded as devotion, where the promise of eternal reward justified unspeakable cruelty, where the pursuit of purity led to practices that would make your blood run cold. Let's set the scene. It's 1275, and you're standing in the Burgundian countryside of France. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Before you rises the Abbey of Cluny, one of the mightiest monasteries in Christendom. Its walls stand like a fortress, its towers piercing the heavens. To the people of this time, this is a place of divine light, a beacon of hope in a world of despair. The faithful flock here, offering their meager coins, their crops, their very lives, believing the monks within are their bridge to salvation. Cluny's abbot answers only to the Pope, free from the oversight of local bishops. Its influence stretches from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, its wealth rivaling that of princes. But what the faithful don't see, what history has buried for centuries, is the darkness festering inside. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution. It was a machine of power. It owned more land than most kings, with estates sprawling across thousands of acres. It collected tithes 10% of every peasant's harvest, every craftsman's earnings, every widow's savings. These tithes were mandatory, enforced by the threat of excommunication, a punishment far worse than mere spiritual exile. To be excommunicated was to be severed from your community, your livelihood, your hope of heaven. It was social and economic death in a world where survival was already a daily battle. At the core of this machine were the religious orders, elite cadres of monks and nuns bound by sacred vows, tasked with carrying out the Church's mission. The Benedictines, founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict of Nursia, built their lives around his rule, a code of communal living rooted in prayer, work, and humility. The Cistercians, born in the 11th century, sought to return to that simplicity, clearing wilderness to build austere abbeys. The Franciscans and Dominicans, emerging in the 13th century, promised reform in a church bloated with wealth. And then there were the Knights Templar, warrior monks who blended faith with the sword, guarding pilgrims and amassing fortunes. These orders were meant to embody the purest Christian devotion, renouncing worldly pleasures for a life of service. But as their wealth grew, so did their temptations. What began as humble communities of faith morphed into sprawling enterprises, their ideals warped by the very human desires they swore to forsake. Monasteries didn't just pray, they ruled. They didn't just serve, they exploited. Their abbots feasted on peacock and venison while peasants scraped by on barley gruel. Their treasuries swelled with gold while villages starved. And in the shadows of their sacred halls, they committed acts that would make even the most hardened cynic recoil. Imagine a young monk, let's call him Brother Thomas, descending into the wine cellars of Cluny Abbey. He expects barrels of modest vintage, enough for the Eucharist and the monk's daily ration. Instead, he finds something else, chests brimming with gold coins, stamped with the seals of distant kings. Silks from Constantinople lie hidden under rough sacks, their vibrant colors mocking the monk's drab habits. Goblets encrusted with jewels glint in the candlelight, treasures that spit in the face of the vow of poverty Brother Thomas swore to uphold. This isn't the humility of Saint Benedict's rule. This is something else entirely, a betrayal of everything the monastery claims to stand for. Brother Thomas's discovery is just the beginning, a crack in the facade that leads us deeper into a world where the sacred and the profane are impossibly intertwined. Why does this matter? Because monasteries weren't just buildings, they were the backbone of medieval society. They shaped how people lived, thought, and died. They controlled knowledge, deciding which texts were preserved and which were burned. They controlled wealth, hoarding resources while the poor begged at their gates. And they controlled salvation, holding the keys to heaven in a world obsessed with the afterlife. For the peasants who tilled the land, the church was both savior and oppressor. They believed the monks' prayers could save their souls, could spare their children from purgatory's flames. But every prayer came at a cost, a tithe of their harvest grain they couldn't afford to lose. A day's labor in the monastery's fields, leaving their own crops untended. A child sent to the monastery as an oblate, a gift to God, never to return home. These oblates, some as young as 7, were promised a life of holiness, but as we'll see, many found only suffering behind those stone walls. The promise of heaven was the peasant's only escape from a life of toil, but that promise was controlled by men who often cared more for gold than for God. For the monks and nuns, life was meant to be one of discipline and devotion. The rule of Saint Benedict laid out a vision of communal living: 6 hours of prayer, 6 hours of work, 6 hours of rest, and time for silent contemplation. Monks rose before dawn for matins, their voices blending in Gregorian chant as they praised God. They labored in scriptoria, copying manuscripts by candlelight, their fingers stained with ink. They tended gardens, brewed ale, and cared for the sick, their lives a testament to humility and service. At least that's what the rule demanded. But those rules were bent, twisted, and broken in ways that would shock the faithful who placed their trust in these holy orders. Monasteries were meant to be a ladder to heaven, a place where the soul could rise above the muck of the world. But for many, they became a descent into a different kind of darkness, a darkness born of greed, ambition, and the abuse of power. The stakes couldn't be higher. The medieval church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the glue holding society together. It decided who was saved and who was damned, who was fed and who starved, who lived and who died. Its monasteries were the heart of the system, where the sacred met the secular, where divine promises met human greed. But when those promises were betrayed, the fallout wasn't just spiritual, it was catastrophic. Entire communities were exploited, their labor and faith siphoned off to fuel the church's wealth. Knowledge was suppressed, with ancient texts burned or locked away to preserve the church's authority. Faith itself was twisted into a tool of control, a weapon to keep the masses in line. Picture a peasant family, their faces weathered by years of toil, standing at the gates of a monastery. They've brought their youngest son, a boy of 8, to offer as an oblate. They believe this is his path to salvation, a way to secure God's favor for their family. The monk at the gate takes the boy, his expression unreadable, and the heavy iron gate slams shut. The mother reaches out, her hand trembling, but the boy is gone. She tells herself he'll be safe, cared for, educated in the ways of God. But what she doesn't know, what she can't know, is the fate awaiting him inside. That fate and the lies hiding it are what we'll uncover as we journey deeper. Here's where you come in. As we embark on this journey, think about trust. Have you ever believed in an institution, a school, a government, a church, only to discover it wasn't what it seemed? Maybe it was a leader who promised change but delivered excuses, or an organization hiding flaws behind a shiny facade. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this isn't just a story from the past. It is a mirror for our own time. The monasteries promise light, but their shadows were long and dark. And as we step through their gates, we'll find the line between sacred and profane is thinner than you might imagine. Those monasteries weren't just places of prayer, they were empires in their own right, wielding power that rivaled kings. How did humble communities of monks and nuns become some of the most dominant forces in Europe? It starts with their beginnings, rooted in ideals of poverty and devotion, but twisted by the weight of wealth and ambition. In the 6th century, Saint Benedict founded his order with a simple vision, a life of prayer, work, and humility. His rules spread across Europe, birthing hundreds of monasteries. By the 11th century, the Cistercians emerged, vowing to return to that purity, building abbeys in remote valleys. The 13th century saw the Franciscans and Dominicans preaching to the masses, and the Knights Templar banking for crusaders. Each order started with noble intent, but their growth was staggering. By 1300, Europe had over 10,000 monasteries, controlling a third of all arable land. Their wealth came from tithes, donations, and land grants gifts from nobles seeking divine favor or political alliances. The Abbey of Cluny alone owned thousands of acres, its abbot dining with emperors. But with wealth came power, and with power came temptation. How did these orders stray so far from their vows? And what price did the faithful pay for their ambition? That's where we're headed next, as we uncover the rise of these monastic empires and the cracks that began to form in their sacred foundations. Those monasteries, towering over the medieval landscape like fortresses of faith, weren't just places of prayer. They were empires in their own right, wielding power that rivaled kings and emperors. How did humble communities of monks and nuns, bound by vows of poverty and devotion, become some of the most dominant forces in Europe? How did they amass wealth so vast it dwarfed the treasuries of princes, and what price did the faithful pay for their ambition? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're peeling back the layers of history to reveal the truth behind those sacred walls. If you're just joining us, drop a comment with where you're watching from Tokyo. Toronto, or somewhere in between, and let's dive into the rise of these monastic empires together. And if you're hooked on uncovering history's hidden truths, smash that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Let's step back to the 6th century where it all began. Imagine a rugged hillside in Italy where a man named Benedict of Nursia retreats from a world he sees as corrupt. He's a hermit at heart, seeking solitude to commune with God, but his vision sparks something bigger. He writes a guide for communal living based on prayer, work, and humility. It's simple but revolutionary. Monks live together, share everything, and dedicate their lives to God. They rise before dawn for prayers, labor in fields or scriptoria, and eat modest meals of bread and broth. This rule spreads like wildfire, and by the year 600, Benedictine monasteries dot the European landscape, from Italy's Monte Cassino to the misty valleys of England. These early communities are small, often just a dozen monks, living in rough stone buildings. Their lives a testament to simplicity, but simplicity doesn't last. Fast forward to the 10th century, and the world has changed. Europe is emerging from the chaos of the Dark Ages. Viking raids have slowed, and trade routes are reopening. The church, now a central pillar of society, sees monasteries as its outposts. Nobles, seeking favor with God or political leverage, donate vast tracts of land to these religious houses. A lord might give a monastery 100 acres to secure prayers for his soul, or to curry favor with a powerful abbot who whispers in the king's ear. By 1000, monasteries like Cluny in France are no longer humble hermitages. They re-sprawling complexes with churches grander than cathedrals, their lands stretching for miles. Cluny, founded in 910, becomes the gold standard. Its abbot answers only to the Pope, free from local bishops or lords. Its wealth comes from tithes, 10% of every peasant as harvest, and from pilgrims who flock to see its holy relics, leaving offerings of silver and grain. Let's paint a picture. You're a peasant in 11th century Burgundy, standing outside Cluny's gates. The abbey looms before you, its stone walls gleaming in the morning sun. You've walked miles, carrying a sack of barley, your family's last to offer as a tithe. You believe the monk's prayers will save your soul, maybe even spare your sick child from death. Inside, you glimpse a world of splendor, golden candelabras, tapestries woven with biblical scenes, monks in fine wool chanting in a church that soars to the heavens. But you don't see the abbot's private chambers, where he dines on roasted pheasant, or the locked rooms where gold is counted. You don't know that Cluny's lands span thousands of acres, worked by serfs who'll never see the wealth their labor creates. To you, this is a house of God. To the abbot, it's a business. This is where the monastic empire begins to take shape. By the 12th century, religious orders multiply, each with its own flavor. The Cistercians, founded in 1098, reject Cluny's opulence, building austere abbeys in remote valleys. They vow to live by manual labor, clearing forests and draining swamps to create fertile fields, but their discipline pays off too well. Their farms produce surplus crops, their wool becomes Europe's finest, and soon Cistercian abbeys like Reval in England are as wealthy as Cluny, their simplicity a distant memory. Then come the mendicant orders in the 13th century, Franciscans and Dominicans, who swear to live among the people, preaching and begging for alms. St. Francis of Assisi, with his love for poverty and nature, inspires thousands. But even his order can't resist the pull of wealth. By 1300, Franciscan houses own vast properties, their leaders living better than the merchants they once served. And let's not forget the Knights Templar, the rock stars of the monastic world. Born during the Crusades, they're monks with swords, sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, but they're also bankers, inventing early forms of checks and loans. Kings and nobles deposit gold with the Templars in Paris, withdrawing it in Jerusalem. By 1200, the Templars are Europe's richest order, their preceptories fortified monasteries stacked with treasure. Their Red Cross banners fly from London to Acre, but their wealth makes them targets, and their secrets will soon haunt them. How did this happen? How did vows of poverty lead to such staggering wealth? It starts with land. Monasteries receive donations from nobles, often in exchange for prayers or political alliances. A dying lord might bequeath half his estate to secure his soul's passage to heaven. A king might grant land to keep an abbot loyal. By 1300, it's estimated that monasteries controlled a third of Europe as arable land, millions of acres worked by serfs who paid rent in crops or labor. Monasteries also ran markets, mills, and forges, charging fees for every transaction. A peasant grinding grain at the abbey's mill paid a tenth of his flour. A merchant crossing monastic land paid a toll. These small fees, multiplied across thousands of transactions, filled monastic coffers. Then there were relics, bones, splinters, or scraps of cloth said to belong to saints. Monasteries like St. Denis claimed to have the crown of thorns, drawing pilgrims who paid to pray before it. A single relic turned a backwater abbey into a bustling hub, with inns, markets, and workshops springing up around it. But relics were often forged, a dirty secret we'll explore later. For now, know that pilgrims' offerings, jewelry, livestock poured into monastic treasuries, turning abbeys into economic powerhouses. Let's zoom in on Cluny again. By 1100, it's not just a monastery, it's a network. Cluny oversees hundreds of daughter houses across Europe, each sending a portion of their income to the mother abbey. Its church, Cluny III, is the largest in Christendom, bigger than St. Peter's in Rome. Building it cost a fortune, funded by tithes and donations. The abbot lives like a prince, with a private chapel and a retinue of servants. Monks dine on fish from monastic ponds, drink wine from monastic vineyards, and wear habits of fine wool. Meanwhile, the peasants outside, who gave their last grains to fund this splendor, go hungry. The vow of poverty, meant to free monks from worldly cares, has become a cruel irony. But wealth brought power, and power brought influence. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were political players. Abbots sat on royal councils, advising kings on war and taxes. The Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux preached the Second Crusade, rallying knights to fight in the Holy Land. The Templars lent money to kings, making them indispensable and dangerously powerful. Monasteries also controlled justice on their lands, with their own courts and prisons. A serf who stole bread from a monastic granary could face branding or worse, while the abbot who hoarded that grain faced no reckoning. This power wasn't just economic or political, it was spiritual. Monasteries held the keys to salvation. In a world obsessed with the afterlife, where purgatory's flames loomed large, the faithful believed monks' prayers could tip the scales toward heaven. Nobles paid handsomely for masses to speed their souls through purgatory. A single mass might cost a year's wages for a peasant, but monasteries offered thousands, each one a transaction. The spiritual economy gave monasteries leverage over everyone, from serfs to kings. Refuse to pay your tithe? Risk excommunication? Question the abbot's authority? Face accusations of heresy, a crime punishable by death. Let's meet Brother Thomas again, our young monk from Cluny. He's heard the stories of St. Benedict's humility, but now he sees the truth. He walks past the abbey's stables, where horses finer than the king's are groomed. He overhears monks haggling with merchants over wine prices, their voices sharp with greed. In the scriptorium, he copies not scripture, but charters granting the abbey more land. He's starting to wonder, is this what God intended? His doubt is a spark, one that will grow as we uncover what lies deeper within these walls. But it's not just wealth that transforms these monasteries, it's ambition. Abbots compete for prestige, building grander churches, acquiring rarer relics. Cluny's rivals, like the Abbey of Vézelay, boast their own relics, Mary Magdalene's bones, they claim, drawing pilgrims away. This competition fuels a cycle of excess. To build bigger, monasteries need more land, more tithes, more labor. They expand their estates, forcing peasants to work longer hours. They raise tithes, leaving families with less to eat. And they lean harder on the faithful, selling indulgences, promises of reduced time in purgatory for ever higher prices. The system wasn't built in a day. It grew over centuries, rooted in the church's unique position. Unlike secular lords, monasteries didn't have to worry about heirs or dynastic wars. Their wealth accumulated, generation after generation, untouched by inheritance disputes. They also have the church's protection, with papal decrees shielding them from local taxes or seizures. And they had the ultimate trump card, divine authority. Who could challenge a monastery without challenging God himself? But with great power comes great vulnerability. The more wealth monasteries amassed, the more they strayed from their vows. The vow of poverty became a joke when abbots lived like lords. The vow of chastity faltered as scandals whispered through cloisters. We'll dive into those later. And the vow of obedience, meant to bind monks to God, became a tool to silence dissent. Monks like Brother Thomas, who questioned the abbot's wealth, risked punishment, solitary confinement, fasting, or worse. Let's pause for a moment. Think about power in your own world. Have you ever seen an institution, a company, a government, a charity grow so powerful it forgot its original purpose? Maybe it started with good intentions, but ended up serving itself. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what we were seeing in these monasteries isn't just a medieval problem. It is a human one. How do you hold power accountable when it's cloaked in divine authority? That's the question Brother Thomas is starting to ask, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The rise of these monastic empires wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. Monasteries controlled land, labor, and souls. They shaped the medieval world, from the crops in the fields to the prayers in the churches. But every empire has its cracks, and these were starting to show. The faithful began to notice the gap between the monks' vows and their lives. Peasants grumbled as tithes left them hungry. Merchants whispered about forged relics. And inside the cloisters, monks like Brother Thomas felt the weight of their doubts. How could they reconcile their faith with the gold piling up around them? These cracks would widen, but for now, the monasteries stood tall, their power seemingly unbreakable. Yet the seeds of their downfall were already sown. How did the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience meant to guide these holy men become twisted into tools of corruption? And what happened when those vows were broken, not just in secret, but openly, shamelessly? That's where we're headed next, as we step deeper into the cloisters to uncover the betrayal of those sacred promises and the human cost of a system built on faith but fueled by greed. The rise of these monastic empires, built on the backs of the faithful, was a triumph of ambition over humility. Monasteries like Cluny and Rievaulx, swollen with land and gold, stood as testaments to power, their abbots dining with kings while preaching poverty to the poor. But how did these holy men, bound by sacred vows, stray so far from the path they swore to follow? How did the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, meant to lift them closer to God, become twisted into tools of corruption? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're peeling back the myths to reveal the truth. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Paris, Perth, or somewhere else entirely, and let's uncover the betrayal that festered within these sacred walls together. If you're gripped by this dive into history's shadows, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Picture a monk standing before an altar, his head bowed, hands clasped, swearing his vows in a candlelit church. The year is 1275, and he's pledging his life to poverty, chastity, and obedience, the three pillars of monastic life. These vows, rooted in the rule of Saint Benedict, were meant to free monks from worldly desires, to make them living examples of Christian virtue. Poverty meant owning nothing, sharing all in common. Chastity meant renouncing the flesh, dedicating body and soul to God. Obedience meant submitting to the abbot's authority as if to God himself. These were sacred promises sealed before the faithful, meant to guide monasteries through a world of sin. But promises are only as strong as the men who keep them. And in the shadowed cloisters of medieval Europe, those promises were broken in ways that would shock the souls who trusted them. Let's start with poverty, the vow that defined the monastic ideal. Saint Benedict's rule was clear. Monks were to own nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. Their lives were to be simple, their needs met by the monastery's shared resources: bread, broth, a straw pallet for sleep. But by the 12th century, this vow was a hollow shell for many. Take Cluny, the jewel of monasticism. Its abbot lived in a private manor, complete with servants and a stable of fine horses. His table groaned with delicacies, roasted swan, spiced wine, fruits from distant lands, while peasants outside the gates starved on barley gruel. The abbey's church, Cluny III, was a marvel, its vaulted ceilings higher than any cathedral, its altars adorned with gold and silver. Building it cost a fortune, paid for by tithes squeezed from families who could barely feed their children. Monks wore habits of fine wool, not the coarse cloth of their founder's day. Their cloisters were lined with tapestries, their dormitories warmed by roaring fires. This was not poverty, it was opulence, cloaked in the language of faith. How did this happen? Wealth changed everything. Monasteries, as we saw, controlled vast estates. Some, like the Cistercians, owned tens of thousands of acres. Their fields produced surplus crops. Their flocks yielded wool prized across Europe. They ran mills, markets, and forges, charging fees that filled their coffers. By 1200, Cluny's annual income rivaled that of small kingdoms, with gold flowing from tithes, pilgrim offerings, and rents. Abbots justified this wealth as God's blessing, a sign of divine favor. They built grander churches to glorify God, they said, but those churches glorified their own power. A monk like Brother Thomas, our guide from Cluny, might walk past a treasury stacked with silver, his vow of poverty ringing hollow as he saw abbots live like lords. The faithful, meanwhile, believed their tithes funded prayers for their souls, not banquets for the elite. But it wasn't just abbots. Entire monasteries strayed. Take the Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans in England. By the 13th century, its monks owned personal allowances, cash for wine, clothes, even private trips. Some kept hunting dogs, a pastime forbidden by the rule. Others leased monastery lands to merchants, pocketing the profits. The vow of poverty became a technicality. Monks owned nothing personally, but their monasteries were rich and they lived in luxury by association. The faithful saw only the facade monks chanting in grand churches, their voices soaring to heaven. They didn't see the locked rooms where gold was counted or the kitchens where feasts were prepared. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was hidden behind stone walls and sacred rituals. Now, let's turn to chastity, the vow that promised purity of body and soul. Monks and nuns swore to renounce the flesh, to live as celibates dedicated to God, in a world where marriage and family were the norm. This was a radical sacrifice, a sign of their holiness. But the reality was far darker. By the 12th century, stories of broken chastity echoed through Europe's cloisters. At the convent of Santa Agata in Italy, nuns were found running what amounted to a brothel, their vows mocked by liaisons with local clergy and nobles. In England, the Priory of Amesbury was notorious for its wayward sisters, some of whom bore children fathered by monks or knights. These weren't isolated scandals chronicles from the time. like those of Gerald of Wales, describe monasteries where chastity was more exception than rule. Why did this happen? Monastic life was isolating, and human nature is frail. Monks and nuns, often young and forced into vows by families or circumstance, lived in close quarters, their desires suppressed but not erased. Some abbots turned a blind eye, especially when powerful men were involved. A noble who paid handsomely for a monastery's prayers might be granted access to a convent, his sins absolved with a donation. In some cases, monasteries profited directly. At the convent of Wotton in Yorkshire, a nun's illicit pregnancy was hushed up, her child spirited away, and the monastery's reputation preserved for a price. The church itself covered these scandals, issuing vague reforms while protecting its own. Bishops, often monks themselves, had little incentive to expose their brothers. But the betrayal of chastity wasn't just about secret affairs, it was systemic. Some monasteries became hubs of exploitation. Nuns, especially those from poorer families, were vulnerable to abbesses or priests who wielded power over them. Monks, living in all-male communities, sometimes turned to each other or to outsiders, their vows crumbling under temptation or coercion. The faithful who saw nuns as brides of Christ had no idea. They prayed before altars adorned with relics, believing the monastery's purity amplified their prayers. The truth that some of these holy women and men lived lives of secret vice was buried, often with the church's blessing. The vow of obedience, meant to bind monks to God through their abbot, was perhaps the most insidious when corrupted. Obedience demanded absolute submission, no questions asked. An abbot's word was law, his authority divine. But what happened when that authority was abused? At Cluny, abbots used obedience to silence dissent. A monk like Brother Thomas, troubled by the abbey's wealth, might be ordered to fast for days or confined to a dark cell for speaking out. Disobedience was heresy, and heresy could mean expulsion or worse. In some monasteries, obedience became a tool of control, forcing monks to ignore their conscience. At the Abbey of St. Gall, a monk who questioned the abbot's dealings with a local lord was flogged, his cries echoing through the cloister as a warning to others. This wasn't just about discipline, it was about power. Abbots ruled like feudal lords, their authority unchecked by bishops or kings, thanks to papal exemptions. They demanded obedience not just from monks, but from the surrounding communities. Peasants on monastic lands were forced to work without pay, their lives governed by the abbey's whims. Refusal meant punishment, fines, imprisonment, or excommunication. The vow of obedience, meant to foster humility, became a chain, binding monks and lay people alike to a system that served the powerful. Let's step into Brother Thomas's shoes again. He's young, idealistic, raised on stories of Saint Benedict's humility. But now he sees the truth. He passes the abbot's private chambers, hearing laughter and the clink of goblets. He overhears monks bartering with merchants, trading relics for coin. In the church, he kneels before an altar dripping with gold, but his prayers feel empty. The vows he swore, poverty, chastity, obedience, seem like a mockery. He wonders, how can this be God's will? His doubt is growing, a spark that could ignite rebellion. But for now, he's alone, trapped in a system that punishes questions. The faithful outside saw none of this. To them, monasteries were holy, their monks and nuns living saints. Peasants brought their last coins to buy prayers, believing the monks' vows made their intercessions powerful. They didn't know that the monk chanting their mass might have spent the night with a mistress, or that the abbot preaching poverty slept on silk. The church guarded these secrets fiercely, issuing decrees to reform monasteries while rarely enforcing them. The Council of Vienne in 1311 called for stricter oversight, but little changed. Why? Because the church depended on the monastery's wealth and influence. Exposing their corruption risked undermining the entire system. This hypocrisy had a cost. Peasants grew resentful as tithes left them hungry. Pilgrims whispered about relics that didn't perform miracles. Townsfolk gossiped about nuns seen with swollen bellies. These murmurs were dangerous, planting seeds of doubt in a world where faith was everything. By the 13th century, chroniclers like Matthew Paris were documenting monastic excesses, their words smuggled in manuscripts that escaped the church's censor. The faithful began to wonder, if the monks' vows were lies, what else was false? Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever trusted someone, a leader, a teacher, an institution, only to discover they weren't what they seemed? Maybe it was a politician promising change while serving themselves, or a company hiding greed behind charity. Drop your story in the comments, because what we're seeing here isn't just medieval, it's human. How do you hold the powerful accountable when they hide behind sacred promises? That's the question Brother Thomas is grappling with, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The corruption of these vows wasn't just a betrayal of faith, it was a betrayal of the vulnerable. The monks and nuns who broke their promises weren't the only victims. The peasants who gave their last grains, the pilgrims who traveled miles, the children sent to monasteries as oblates, they paid the price for this hypocrisy. What happened to those children, those novices, those nuns trapped in a system that preached salvation but delivered suffering? How did the monastery's corruption turn sacred spaces into places of exploitation? That's where we're headed next, as we step deeper into the cloisters to uncover the human toll of these broken vows, and the horrors that awaited the most defenseless behind those stone walls. The corruption of sacred vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience turned monasteries into palaces of hypocrisy, where abbots lived like lords and monks betrayed the very faith they preached. But the cost of this betrayal wasn't borne by the powerful alone. It fell heaviest on the most vulnerable children given to monasteries as oblates, novices bound by vows they barely understood, and nuns trapped in convents that promised salvation but often delivered suffering. How did these sacred spaces, meant to be havens of holiness, become places of exploitation and despair? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're uncovering the truth behind those stone walls. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Dublin, Delhi, or somewhere else entirely, and let's step into the shadows together. If you're gripped by this descent into history's underbelly, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Picture a small village in 1275, nestled in the shadow of a towering abbey. A family stands at the monastery gate, their faces etched with hunger and hope. In their arms is a boy, barely 7, his eyes wide with fear. They're offering him as an oblate, a gift to God, believing his life in the monastery will secure their family's salvation. The monk at the gate nods solemnly, taking the boy's hand as the iron gate clangs shut. The mother stifles a sob, telling herself her son will be safe, educated, holy. But what she doesn't know, what she can't know, is the fate awaiting him inside. This is the story of the innocent, the children, novices, and nuns who entered monasteries seeking divine protection, only to find a world where power corrupted even the sacred. Let's start with the oblates, children as young as 5 or 7, given to monasteries by parents desperate for divine favor or unable to feed another mouth. The practice was common nobles offered sons to secure alliances, peasants to escape poverty's grip. In theory, oblates were to be raised as monks, educated in scripture, and trained in the rule of Saint Benedict. They were promised a life of purpose, their prayers a bridge to heaven for their families. But the reality was often far darker. At monasteries like St. Gall in Switzerland, oblates faced a brutal existence. They were woken before dawn for prayers, their small bodies shivering in unheated dormitories. They labored in fields or kitchens, their hands blistered from tasks meant for grown men. Food was scarce bread and thin broth, while monks dined on better fare. Discipline was harsh. A missed prayer or a dropped tool could earn a flogging, the whip's crack echoing through cloisters. But the physical toll was only part of the horror. Many oblates faced abuse that scarred their bodies and souls. Chronicles from the 12th century, like those of Orderic Vitalis, hint at unspeakable acts. At some monasteries, older monks preyed on young oblates, exploiting their power and the vow of obedience to silence their victims. A boy who spoke out risked punishment, solitary confinement in a dark cell, or worse, accusations of lying, which could lead to expulsion and disgrace. The church, eager to protect its reputation, often covered these scandals. Bishops, themselves monks, turned a blind eye, issuing vague calls for reform while the abuse continued. At the Abbey of Fleury, a 13th century report described children broken by cruelty, their spirits crushed by fear and isolation. These were not sanctuaries, they were prisons for the innocent. Novices, young men and women who entered monasteries as teenagers or adults, fared little better. Many were coarse second sons of nobles with no inheritance, daughters whose families couldn't afford dowries, or orphans with nowhere else to go. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, often without fully understanding their weight. Novices were meant to spend a year in training, proving their devotion before final vows. But this period was a crucible. At Cluny, novices scrubbed floors and copied manuscripts until their hands bled, their days filled with grueling labor and endless prayers. Sleep deprivation was common woken every few hours for nighttime offices. They stumbled through chants in a haze of exhaustion. This wasn't just discipline. It was control, designed to break their will and enforce obedience. For some novices, the betrayal was more sinister. Sexual abuse, though rarely recorded, was a grim reality. A 12th century letter from a monk at Bec Abbey describes unnatural sins among novices, coerced by senior monks who wielded their authority like a weapon. Women novices in convents like Wotton, England, faced similar horrors. A young nun, forced into vows at 15, was seduced by a priest, her pregnancy discovered only when she could no longer hide it. The convent's response was brutal. She was beaten, chained, and her child taken away, all to preserve the monastery's reputation. The priest faced no punishment, his status shielding him. These stories, buried in monastic records, reveal a system that protected the powerful and sacrificed the weak. Nuns, often forgotten in the shadow of monks, faced their own torments. Convents were meant to be sanctuaries for noble women seeking spiritual lives, widows escaping remarriage, or girls with no other place, but many became traps. Nuns took the same vows as monks, but their lives were more confined. They were cloistered, forbidden to leave except in rare cases, their world reduced to stone walls and endless prayers. At the convent of Santa Agata in Italy, nuns were found running a brothel, coerced by a local clergy who paid the abbess for access. The nuns, often poor and powerless, had little choice. Refusal meant punishment, starvation, isolation, or public humiliation. The Church, aware of these scandals, issued decrees like those from the Council of Lateran in 1215, demanding stricter oversight, but enforcement was weak and the abuses continued. The psychological toll on nuns was devastating. Enclosed in convents, they faced relentless control. Abbesses, often from noble families, ruled with iron fists, using the vow of obedience to crush dissent. At the convent of Godstow in England, a nun who questioned her abbess's lavish lifestyle was locked in a cell for weeks, fed only bread and water. Sleep deprivation, fasting, and public shaming were tools to break spirits, ensuring compliance. Some nuns turned to each other for solace, forming forbidden bonds that, if discovered, led to brutal punishments. A 13th century chronicle from Poitiers describes two nuns caught in a sinful embrace. Flogged before the convent and exiled, their names erased from records. The faithful outside these walls knew little of this suffering. They saw nuns as brides of Christ, their prayers pure and powerful. They brought offerings, coins, cloth, livestock, believing these holy women interceded for their souls. But the truth was hidden behind a veil of secrecy. Monasteries and convents were masters of image, their churches gleaming with gold, their rituals a spectacle of piety. When scandals leaked, the church moved swiftly to contain them. A bishop might visit a troubled convent, issue a reprimand, and leave, the abuses left unchecked. The faithful, desperate for salvation, continued to trust, their tithes and children feeding a system that betrayed them. Let's return to Brother Thomas, our monk from Cluny. He's no longer the wide-eyed novice who entered the abbey. Now he's seen the truth. He's watched a young oblate, barely 10, collapse from exhaustion in the fields, only to be whipped for laziness. He's heard whispers of a nun from a nearby convent, her cries echoing at night, her fate hushed by the abbot's orders. He's seen monks turn away as shivering children begging at the gate, their hands empty while the abbey's larders overflow. Thomas's faith is fraying, his vows a weight he can barely carry. He wonders, how can a place meant for God harbor such cruelty? His questions are dangerous, but they're growing louder, a spark that could light a fire. The cost of this betrayal wasn't just personal, it was societal. Monasteries were meant to be the moral heart of Europe, guiding the faithful through a world of sin. But their corruption eroded trust. Peasants began to grumble as they handed over their tithes, their children, their hope. Pilgrims whispered about monasteries that took their offerings but offered no miracles. Townsfolk gossiped about nuns with swollen bellies, monks with mistresses. These murmurs, recorded in chronicles like those of Solomon to Adam, spread like wildfire, planting seeds of doubt in a world where faith was everything. By the 13th century, the church was issuing decrees to curb monastic abuses, but they were too little, too late. The damage was done, the cracks in the system widening. Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever seen the vulnerable children, outsiders, the powerless betrayed by those meant to protect them? Maybe it was a school that ignored bullying, a system that silenced victims, or an institution that valued reputation over justice. Share your thoughts in the comments because this story isn't just medieval, it's human. How do we protect the innocent when power is abused behind closed doors? That's the question Brother Thomas is wrestling with, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The suffering of oblates, novices, and nuns was only the beginning. The monastery's corruption didn't stop at broken vows or exploited individuals. It built entire systems of exploitation, turning sacred spaces into something far darker. How did these institutions, swollen with wealth and power, become medieval crime syndicates, profiting from land, relics, and even human lives? What secrets did they hide to maintain their grip on Europe's soul? That's where we're headed next, as we uncover the monastery's transformation into empires of greed and the shadowy networks that sustain them. The suffering of oblates, novices, and nuns revealed a grim truth. Monasteries, meant to be sanctuaries of faith, often betrayed the vulnerable to protect their power. But the corruption didn't end with broken vows or exploited lives. It ran deeper, transforming these sacred spaces into something far darker. What if monasteries weren't just hypocritical, but operated like medieval crime syndicates, profiting from land, relics, and even human lives? How did these houses of God become empires of greed, their influence built on exploitation and deceit? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're peeling back the layers of history to expose the truth. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from, Rome, Rio, or somewhere else entirely, and let's unravel these shadowy networks together. If you're hooked on this dive into history's underbelly, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Picture a bustling monastery in 1275, its gates open to merchants, pilgrims, and peasants. The air hums with activity carts rumble with grain, monks haggle over wool prices, and pilgrims kneel before a reliquary said to hold St. Peter's finger. To the outside world, this is a house of prayer, its wealth a sign of divine favor. But behind the scenes, a different machine is at work. Monks pore over ledgers, not scriptures, tracking rents from vast estates. Forged charters grant the abbey new lands, snatched from unsuspecting heirs. Relics, titled as holy, are crafted in secret workshops, their miracles staged to draw crowds. This isn't just a monastery, it's a business, a syndicate cloaked in piety, its tentacles stretching across Europe, squeezing profit from every corner of society. Let's start with land, the foundation of monastic wealth. By the 13th century, monasteries controlled a third of Europe's arable land, millions of acres worked by serfs who paid rent and crops. Labor or coin, how did they amass such estates? Some came from noble donations, given in exchange for prayers or political alliances. A lord might grant 100 acres to secure monastery support against a rival. But monasteries weren't passive recipients, they were aggressive players. At Cluny, monks forged charters, documents claiming ancient rights to lands they never owned. These forgeries, written in scriptoria by monks skilled in calligraphy, were backdated to seem legitimate, fooling courts and heirs. A 12th century case at St. Augustine's in Canterbury saw monks produce a royal grant from the 9th century, conveniently discovered to claim a disputed estate. The rightful owner, a minor noble, had no chance against the church's legal muscle. Monasteries also exploited legal loopholes. The church was exempt from many secular taxes, and monks used this to undercut rivals. They bought up land at bargain prices during famines, when desperate peasants sold fields to survive. At the Cistercian Abbey of Fountains in England, monks acquired entire villages this way, turning free farmers into serfs bound to the abbey's lands. These serfs worked monastic fields, their harvests filling granaries while their own families went hungry. Monasteries ran mills, forges, and markets, charging fees for every transaction, tenth of the flour ground, a toll for crossing a bridge. By 1300, the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds owned 20 villages, its income rivaling the king's. This wasn't charity, it was extortion, sanctified by the cross. Relics were another gold mine, turning faith into profit. Every monastery claimed a piece of a saint, a bone, a lock of hair, a splinter of the true cross. Pilgrims flocked to these relics, believing their prayers would bring miracles. A single relic could transform a backwater abbey into a bustling hub, with inns and markets springing up to serve the crowds. But many relics were fake, crafted in monastic workshops. At the Abbey of Reading, monks sold vials of Christ's blood, diluted wine dyed red. At Vézelay, they claimed to have Mary Magdalene's bones, though rival abbeys made the same claim. These forgeries were big business pilgrims paid to touch relics, leaving coins, jewelry, even livestock. A 13th century chronicler, Guibert of Nogent, called relic trade a scandal, noting monks who carved bones from animal carcasses, passing them off as saints' remains. The Knights Templar took this to another level. As warrior monks, they guarded pilgrims but also ran a banking empire. By 1200, they were Europe's first international bank, letting nobles deposit gold in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Their preceptories, fortified monasteries, were vaults, stuffed with treasure. They lent money to kings like Philip II of France at steep interest rates, skirting the church's ban on usury by calling it administrative fees. But their wealth came with secrets. Rumors swirled of hidden vaults, of rituals conducted in locked chapels. By 1307, these whispers would fuel their downfall, as we'll see later. For now, their banking network was a masterclass in profit, blending faith with finance in ways that shocked even their allies. Monasteries also profited from indulgences, selling forgiveness for sins. The church taught that sins earned time in purgatory, but a monk's prayer or a hefty donation could reduce that sentence. By the 13th century, indulgences were a booming industry. At Cluny, monks sold plenary indulgences, promising total forgiveness for a price. A knight might pay a year's wages to erase a murder. A merchant might buy one to atone for cheating customers. These sales funded lavish churches and abbots' lifestyles, while the faithful, desperate for salvation, emptied their purses. The system was so lucrative that monasteries competed, offering better deals to draw penitents. A 1290 record from St. Albans shows monks selling indulgences to entire villages, their promises of heaven masking a cold transaction. But the darkest profit came from human lives. Some monasteries engaged in what we'd now call human trafficking. Convents, especially, were vulnerable. At Santa Agata in Italy, nuns were coerced into prostitution, their bodies sold to local clergy or nobles for donations. The abbess, often a noblewoman with ties to power, took a cut, her convent's holiness a facade. In England, the Priory of Amesbury was notorious for wayward sisters, some sent to noble households as servants, their fates unrecorded. Monks, too, played a role. At the Abbey of St. Gall, records hint at oblates' children given to the monastery being loaned to local lords, their labor or worse traded for favors. These practices were hidden, the church's silence bought with gold or influence. Let's step into the shoes of Brother Thomas, our monk from Cluny. He's seen the abbey's wealth, its broken vows, its cruelty to the vulnerable. Now he stumbles on something worse. In the scriptorium, he finds a forged charter granting Cluny a village it never rightfully owned. In the reliquary, he sees monks polishing a saint's bone that smells of fresh carving. At night, he hears whispers of a deal, an oblate sent to a noble's castle, never to return. Thomas's faith is crumbling, his vows a cage. He wonders, how can a house of God run on lies and exploitation? His questions are dangerous, but he's not alone. Other monks, nuns, even peasants are starting to see the truth. Their murmurs a growing threat to the monastery's power. This wasn't just greed, it was a system, a syndicate with all the trappings of organized crime. Monasteries had networks stretching across Europe. Cluny's daughter houses sent tribute to the Mother Abbey, their profits funneled to Burgundy. The Templars moved gold through secret routes, their couriers dodging bandits and spies. Monastic scribes altered records, erasing debts or inventing rights. Abbots met in secret, striking deals with lords or bishops to protect their interests. When a scandal threatened, like a nun's pregnancy or a forged relic, they closed ranks, silencing witnesses with bribes or threats. A 13th century chronicler, Matthew Paris, wrote of monks who feared no justice but their own, their power shielding them from accountability. The faithful paid the price. Peasants worked monastic lands, their harvest taken while they starved. Pilgrims spent their last coins on fake relics, their prayers unanswered. Families gave children to monasteries, believing they'd find salvation, only to lose them to abuse or worse. The church knew bishops received complaints, councils issued decrees, but reform was rare. Why? Because monasteries were the church's backbone, their wealth funding cathedrals, crusades, even the Pope's court. Exposing their crimes risked collapsing the system. So the church looked away, leaving the vulnerable to suffer and the faithful to trust in lies. The system wasn't invisible, though. By the 13th century, whispers of corruption spread. Peasants grumbled as tithes left them hungry. Merchants scoffed at relics that worked no miracles. Townsfolk told tales of monks with mistresses, nuns with secrets. These murmurs, recorded in chronicles like those of Sullivan to Adam, were dangerous, eroding the church's authority. The faithful began to question if monasteries were corrupt, what else was false? These doubts were sparks, and they'd soon ignite a fire that threatened to consume the church's power. Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever seen an institution, maybe a corporation, a government, a charity operate like a machine, prioritizing profit over people? Maybe it hid its greed behind a noble mission or silenced critics to protect its image. Share your thoughts in the comments because this story isn't just medieval, it's human. How do you challenge a system that's too big to fail, especially when it claims divine authority? That's the question Brother Thomas is facing, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The monastery's crimes didn't stop at land and relics. They extended to knowledge itself. If they could control what people believed, what they knew, they could control the world. How did these institutions hoard and destroy knowledge to maintain their grip? What truths were so dangerous they had to be buried? That's where we're headed next, as we uncover how monasteries became gatekeepers of the mind and the devastating cost of their war on truth. The monasteries' war on knowledge, burning books and hoarding truths, kept Europe in the dark to preserve their power. But whispers of doubt were spreading, peasants grumbling over tithes, scholars demanding hidden texts, monks like Brother Thomas questioning the hypocrisy within their cloisters. These murmurs were dangerous, threatening the church's iron grip on faith and minds. How did these sparks of dissent grow into a fire that challenged the monastery's dominance? What forces, inside and outside their walls, dared to speak truth to power? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're unraveling the threads of a crumbling empire. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Madrid, Mumbai, or somewhere else entirely, and let's fan these sparks together. If you're gripped by this dive into history's shadows, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Picture a muddy village square in 1275, where peasants gather, their faces hardened by hunger. They've just paid their tithe a sack of grain they can't spare to the nearby abbey. A rumor spreads: the abbot dines on venison while they starve. Across the continent, in a Paris tavern, lay scholars debate forbidden texts, their voices low to avoid the church's spies. Inside Cluny's cloisters, a monk whispers to another about forged relics, his words a risk that could cost him everything. These are the sparks of dissent, small but potent, igniting in a world where questioning the church was akin to defying God. The monastery's power seemed unbreakable, but the faithful were beginning to see through the lies, and their anger was growing. Let's start with the peasants, the backbone of the monastic economy. For centuries, they'd given their crops, their labor, their children, believing the monks' prayers secured their salvation. But by the 13th century, the burden was crushing. Tithes took 1/10 of their harvest, sometimes more, as abbots raised demands to fund lavish churches. At Bury St. Edmunds, peasants paid not just grain, but wool, livestock, even their tools, leaving families on the edge of starvation. The Great Famine of 1315, which killed thousands, exposed the monastery's indifference. While monks ate from stocked larders, peasants begged at their gates, turned away empty-handed. Chronicles like those of John of Trocolo describe villagers cursing abbots, their faith shaken by the gap between preached poverty and monastic wealth. These weren't just grumbles, they were acts of defiance. In 1280, peasants near the Abbey of Ramsey rioted, burning monastic barns after their tithes were doubled. The monks called it heresy, but the villagers saw it as justice. Such uprisings were rare but telling, showing a growing willingness to challenge the church's authority. Townsfolk, too, were restless. Merchants, growing wealthy from trade, resented monastic monopolies on markets and mills. At St. Albans, a 1274 dispute saw townspeople storm the abbey, demanding lower tolls. The monks, backed by the king, crushed the revolt, but the message was clear: The faithful were no longer blind. Inside the monasteries, dissent was brewing too. Not all monks were complicit in the corruption. Some, like Brother Thomas at Cluny, were troubled by what they saw: gold-filled treasuries, forged charters, abused oblates. These monks faced a choice: silence or rebellion. Speaking out was perilous. Obedience bound them to the abbot, and defiance meant punishment. A 13th century monk at Fleury, caught questioning the abbot's land grabs, was locked in a cell for months, his rations cut to bread and water. Yet some dared to act. At the Abbey of Bec, a group of monks smuggled a letter to a bishop detailing their abbot's lavish feasts and secret mistresses. The bishop, tied to the monastery's wealth, ignored it, but the letter reached lay scholars, fueling rumors that spread beyond the cloisters. The church itself was fracturing, sowing seeds of dissent. The Great Schism of 1054 had already split Christianity into Catholic and Orthodox branches, weakening Rome's claim to universal authority. By the 14th century, the Western Church faced its own crisis: the Avignon papacy. From 1309, popes resided in France, not Rome, seen as puppets of French kings. This split loyalty: some monasteries backed Rome, others Avignon created chaos. Abbots played politics, aligning with whichever pope promised more power. At Cluny, the abbot swore allegiance to Avignon, gaining papal favors but alienating local bishops. This division eroded trust as the faithful wondered, if the church was divided, who spoke for God? Lay scholars, outside monastic control, were another spark. By the 13th century, universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were training lawyers, doctors, and theologians who didn't owe allegiance to monasteries. These scholars demanded access to texts locked in abbey vaults, works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy. In 1260, a group at Oxford raided a monastery's library, seizing manuscripts on astronomy and logic. The monks cried heresy, but the scholars copied the texts, spreading ideas that challenged church doctrine. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan monk turned scholar, criticized monastic ignorance, calling for science over superstition. His 1267 Opus Majus, smuggled to the Pope, argued for studying nature, not burning books. Bacon was imprisoned, but his ideas reached lay readers, planting seeds of reform. Women, too, raised their voices. Female mystics like Catherine of Siena, born in 1347, challenged monastic corruption with visions and letters. Catherine, a Dominican tertiary, wrote to abbots and popes condemning their greed and calling for reform. Her 1370s letters accused monasteries of devouring souls with their wealth, her words bold for a woman in a male-dominated church. Though not yet active in 1275, her later influence echoed earlier female voices like Hildegard of Bingen, who in the 12th century criticized monks for neglecting their vows. These women, often dismissed by abbots, reached the faithful through sermons and letters, their defiance inspiring others to question. The rise of heretical movements fanned these flames. Groups like the Cathars and Waldensians, active in the 12th and 13th centuries, rejected monastic wealth and church authority. The Waldensians, preaching poverty, accused monks of betraying Christ's teachings. Their ideas spread among peasants who saw parallels between their own struggles and the heretics' critiques. The church responded with violence. The Albigensian Crusade of 1209 crushed the Cathars, burning thousands at the stake, but repression only fueled resentment. Survivors spread their ideas underground, their pamphlets calling monasteries dens of thieves. These heresies, though small, showed the faithful they could challenge the church and live. Technology was another spark, though its full impact was yet to come. By 1275, manuscripts were becoming cheaper, thanks to improved paper production from the Islamic world. Lay scribes, outside monastic control, began copying texts, chronicles, satires, even forbidden works. These manuscripts circulated in cities where literate merchants and artisans read tales of monastic corruption. A 13th century satire, the Gospel According to the Silver Marks, mocked monks who sold salvation for coin. Such texts, though rare, reached eager audiences, eroding the monastery's aura of holiness. The printing press, still 2 centuries away, would amplify this, but for now, handwritten dissent was enough to spark unease. Let's return to Brother Thomas at Cluny. He's no longer the silent monk copying psalms. He's heard the peasants' curses, seen the smuggled pamphlets, whispered with other monks about reform. One night, he finds a hidden text, a letter from a monk decrying the abbot's greed. Thomas hesitates, knowing that sharing it risks excommunication, but his conscience burns. He passes the letter to a trusted novice, who slips it to a lay scholar visiting the abbey. That scholar, part of Paris's growing university, spreads the word. Thomas's act is small, but it's a spark, joining countless others across Europe. From village squares to city taverns, the faithful are waking up, their trust in monasteries fraying. The church felt this threat. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council issued reforms, demanding monks live by their vows and abbots curb excesses. But these were half measures, ignored by powerful monasteries like Cluny, whose wealth bought papal leniency. The church also tightened control, banning lay preaching and censoring text. In 1231, the Inquisition began targeting heretics, its Dominican monks hunting dissenters. But these efforts backfired. Every burned heretic, every silenced scholar, fueled anger. By 1300, chroniclers like Salimbend Adam noted growing scorn for monks, their once sacred image tarnished. The faithful were changing too. Urban growth created a new class, merchants, artisans, lawyers, who didn't rely on monasteries. These city dwellers, literate and wealthy, questioned why monks controlled knowledge and wealth. In 1287, Florence's guilds funded a lay school, teaching logic and law without monastic oversight. Such schools spread skepticism, their students demanding reform. Even nobles, once monastery allies, grew wary. A 1290 dispute saw a French lord sue an abbey for forged land claims, his lawyers citing monastic corruption. These challenges, small but growing, showed a world no longer content to bow. Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever seen people rise against a system they once trusted? Maybe a community challenged a corrupt leader, or a movement exposed hidden wrongs. Share your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just medieval, it's human. How do you spark change when power seems absolute? That's the question Brother Thomas and countless others faced, their whispers building toward a reckoning. Those sparks were igniting a fire that would soon rage. The monastery's empire, built on wealth, exploitation, and control, was cracking under its own weight. How did these dissenters, peasants, scholars, mystics turn their murmurs into a roar that shook the church? What events finally pushed the monasteries toward collapse? That's where we're headed next, as we uncover the forces that brought these sacred empires to their knees, and the dawn of a new era that rose from their ruins. The sparks of dissent peasants cursing tithes, scholars smuggling forbidden texts, monks whispering of reform, were igniting a fire that threatened the monastery's iron grip on medieval Europe. Their empire, built on wealth, exploitation, and control, seemed unassailable, yet cracks were widening under the weight of their own corruption. How did these murmurs of discontent grow into a roar that shook the very foundations of the church? What forces, disease, rebellion, and new ideas finally brought these sacred empires to their knees? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're unraveling the fall of a system that shaped a continent. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Berlin, Bangkok, or somewhere else entirely, and let's witness this collapse together. If you're gripped by this dive into history's shadows, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the full story. Picture a windswept hill in 1348, where a monastery's stone walls stand defiant against a darkening sky. Inside, monks chant prayers, their voices trembling as rumors of a new plague sweep the land. Outside, villages lie silent, their fields untended, their people dying in droves. This is the Black Death, a catastrophe that will kill a third of Europe's population. And it's more than a disease, it's a reckoning. The monasteries, once beacons of salvation, are about to face a crisis that exposes their spiritual bankruptcy and shatters their authority. This moment, combined with rising rebellion and new ideas, marks the beginning of the end for their empire, a collapse that reshapes the medieval world. Let's start with the Black Death, striking Europe from 1347 to 1351. This plague was unlike anything before. Bodies piled in streets, entire towns vanished, and fear gripped every soul. The faithful turned to monasteries, believing their prayers could stop the scourge. But the monks, despite their claims of divine favor, were as helpless as anyone. At Cluny, half the monks died, their grand church echoing with empty chants. At the Abbey of St. Albans, records show monks fleeing, abandoning their vows to escape the pestilence. Those who stayed often profited, selling masses for the dead at inflated prices. A single prayer could cost a peasant's life savings. The faithful, desperate for salvation, paid, but the bodies kept piling up, and no miracles came. This failure was devastating. Monasteries had built their power on the promise of divine protection. When that promise failed, trust crumbled. Peasants who'd given their last coins for prayers saw monks die alongside them, their sacred status meaningless against the plague. Chronicles like those of Jean Froissart describe villagers turning bitter, accusing monks of hoarding wealth while offering empty rituals. In 1349, a mob attacked the Abbey of Meaux, burning its granaries, shouting that monks had failed God and man. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it killed faith in the monastery's holiness, exposing them as mortal, fallible, and often greedy. But the plague was only one blow. The rise of cities and a new urban class was eroding monastic power. By the 14th century, towns like Florence, London, and Bruges were thriving, their wealth coming from trade, not land. Merchants, artisans, and lawyers, literate and independent, didn't need monasteries to mediate their faith or economy. These city dwellers built their own churches, funded lay preachers, and supported schools that taught law and medicine without monastic oversight. In 1300, Bologna's university trained lawyers who challenged monastic land claims, citing forged charters. In 1350, London's guilds funded hospitals, bypassing monks who once monopolized charity. This shift drained monasteries of influence. Why tithe to an abbey when a city church offered the same prayers for less? Universities were another threat. By 1300, Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were hubs of learning, free from monastic control. Unlike abbey scriptoria, which hoarded texts, universities shared knowledge, teaching Aristotle, Galen, and Roman law to lay students. These scholars, unbound by vows, questioned church doctrine. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris tried to ban Aristotle's works, but university students ignored him, copying texts in secret. A 1320 dispute at Oxford saw scholars demand access to monastic libraries, accusing monks of burying truth for profit. These universities bred anew elite lawyers, doctors, advisors to kings, who owed no loyalty to abbeys. Their rise shifted power from cloisters to classrooms, weakening the monastery's grip on knowledge. Rebellions, both small and large, added fuel to the fire. In 1381, England's peasants' revolt saw thousands storm monasteries, burning records of tithes and debts. At St. Albans, rebels smashed the abbey's millstones, a symbol of monastic extortion. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 targeted abbeys, peasants enraged by tithes that left them starving. These uprisings weren't just about economics, they were about betrayal. The faithful felt cheated by monks who preached poverty but lived in luxury. Chronicles from the time, like those of Henry Knighton, describe rebels chanting, "The monks have stolen our souls and our bread." Though crushed, these revolts showed a growing defiance, a refusal to bow to sacred authority. The Church's own failures accelerated the collapse. The Avignon papacy, from 1309 to 1377, saw popes live in France, seen as pawns of French kings. This fractured the Church, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon excommunicating each other. Monasteries split loyalties, Cluny backed Avignon, while English abbeys stayed with Rome, creating chaos. The faithful, confused by dueling popes, questioned the Church's claim to divine truth. In 1378, the Western Schism began, with two popes claiming legitimacy, further eroding trust. Abbots, once untouchable, were now seen as political players, their spiritual authority tarnished. A 1370s chronicler, Thomas Walsingham, wrote that the Church devours itself, its monasteries caught in the crossfire. Internal reform efforts meant to save the system often failed. The Cistercians, once champions of simplicity, tried to curb excesses in the 13th century, but their abbeys were too rich to change. The conciliar movement of the early 15th century pushed for church councils to override corrupt popes, but monasteries resisted, fearing loss of power. At Cluny, a 1330 reform ordered monks to live by their vows, but abbots ignored it, their wealth shielding them from papal decrees. These failures showed the faithful that the Church couldn't or wouldn't fix itself, fueling calls for change. Lay movements, outside monastic control, were another blow. Groups like the Brethren of the Common Life, founded in the 14th century, preached simple faith without monks or tithes. They taught lay people to read scripture, bypassing monastic mediators. In 1370s Italy, the Fraticelli, radical Franciscans, denounced wealthy abbeys, calling them synagogues of Satan. These groups, though small, resonated with the faithful, who saw them as truer to Christ's teachings than gold-laden monks. Their ideas spread through markets and taverns, carried by merchants and artisans who no longer feared the Church's wrath. Let's return to Brother Thomas at Cluny. He's no longer just a doubter, he's a witness to collapse. The Black Death has ravaged the abbey, its dormitories half empty. He hears of peasant revolts, their anger echoing his own. A lay scholar visiting to buy wine slips him a pamphlet, a satire mocking monastic greed. Thomas hides it, knowing the abbot's spies are watching. But he's not alone. Other monks whisper of reform, their voices cautious but growing. Outside, the faithful are changing merchants fund lay churches, scholars teach forbidden texts, and peasants defy tithes. Thomas feels the world shifting, the monastery's power slipping. His faith, once anchored in Cluny's grandeur, now rests in the truth he's beginning to embrace. The monastery's collapse wasn't sudden, it was a slow erosion, accelerated by catastrophe and defiance. By 1400, their influence was waning. Cities grew, universities thrived, and lay movements offered new paths to faith. The Church, desperate to hold power, leaned on the Inquisition, burning heretics and books. But this only deepened resentment. A 1390s chronicle by John of Glastonbury notes scorn for monks among the faithful, their once sacred image now a joke. The stage was set for a greater upheaval. The Protestant Reformation would soon shatter the Church's unity, but its roots lay here in these 14th century sparks. Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever seen a system, government, company, or institution crumble under its own flaws? Maybe it was a leader exposed, a scandal revealed, or a movement that refused to stay silent. Share your thoughts in the comments because this isn't just medieval, it's human. How do you topple a giant when it's built on centuries of power? That's the question Brother Thomas and his world faced, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The monasteries' fall left a void, but their legacy lingered, shaping faith, society, and power for centuries. How did their collapse ripple through history, influencing the world we know today? What lessons did they leave for us as we navigate our own institutions? That's where we're headed next, as we explore the long shadow of monastic corruption and the enduring cautionary tale it offers. The collapse of the monastic empire, battered by plague, rebellion, and rising skepticism, marked the end of an era when monasteries held Europe's faith, wealth, and minds in their grasp. Yet, as their stone walls crumbled and their influence faded, the echoes of their corruption lingered, shaping the world in ways that still resonate today. How did the monasteries' betrayal of their vows, their exploitation of the vulnerable, and their war on knowledge leave scars on faith, society, and power? What lessons do these fallen empires offer us as we navigate our own institutions? Welcome back to our journey into the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're tracing the ripples of a broken system. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Vienna, Vancouver, or somewhere else entirely, and let's explore this legacy together. If you're hooked on this dive into history's depths, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for the final chapters. Picture a ruined monastery in 1400, its once grand arches crumbling, ivy creeping over cracked stones. The Black Death has left its dormitories empty, peasant revolts have burned its granaries, and new voices, scholars, mystics, lay preachers challenge its authority. The faithful, who once knelt before its relics, now pass by with weary eyes, their trust eroded by tales of greed and betrayal. This is no longer the heart of Christendom, it's a relic of a fading age. But the monastery's fall wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point, reshaping how Europe thought about faith, power, and truth. Their corruption left a long shadow, influencing the Reformation, modern skepticism, and the very idea of accountability in institutions. Let's start with faith. Monasteries were the spiritual anchors of medieval Europe, their monks and nuns seen as intermediaries between God and humanity. Their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience promised a purity that made their prayers powerful, their relics miraculous. But when those vows were exposed as lies, when abbots lived like kings, monks broke chastity, and nuns suffered in silence, the faithful felt betrayed. This wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. The church had promised salvation, but its monasteries delivered exploitation. Chronicles from the 14th century, like those of Henry Knighton, describe peasants questioning whether monks' prayers held any weight, their faith shaken by the gap between preached ideals and lived realities. This crisis of faith fueled the Protestant Reformation, a seismic shift that began a century later. By the 16th century, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin built on the doubts sown in the 1300s. Luther, a former monk, knew the monastery's flaws firsthand. His 1795 theses condemned indulgences, echoing the 14th century peasants who cursed monks for selling salvation. He called monasteries dens of iniquity, a sentiment rooted in the scandals of Cluny and St. Albans. The Reformation dismantled monastic power in much of Europe. England's monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII in the 1530s, their lands seized, their relics smashed. This wasn't just a religious revolt. It was a reckoning for centuries of betrayal, sparked by the murmurs we heard in village squares and scriptoria. But the impact went beyond religion. The monasteries' fall reshaped society, breaking their stranglehold on land and wealth. By 1400, their estates were shrinking, some seized by kings, others sold to rising merchants. In England, the dissolution of monasteries redistributed a third of the country's land, creating a new class of landowners. These former monastic estates fueled the growth of capitalism as merchants and gentry turned fields into markets. In cities like Florence and Bruges, the decline of monastic influence empowered urban elites, merchants, lawyers, artisans who built banks, schools, and civic institutions free from church control. This shift laid the groundwork for modern economies, where wealth flowed through trade, not tithes. The monasteries where knowledge left its own scars. By hoarding texts and burning heretical works, they delayed Europe's intellectual progress. The loss of classical texts on medicine, astronomy, philosophy kept Europe in the dark while the Islamic world preserved and expanded on them. When universities like Paris and Oxford broke monastic monopolies, they sparked a renaissance of learning, but the cost of centuries of suppression was steep. A 15th century scholar, Poggio Bracciolini, rediscovered Lucretius's On the Nature of Things in a monastic library, a text buried for its pagan ideas. Such rediscoveries fueled the Renaissance, but they also highlighted what was lost generations denied access to ideas that could have advanced medicine, science, and thought. This suppression also bred skepticism, a legacy that shapes our world. The faithful, betrayed by monks who burned truth to protect power, began to question authority itself. By the 15th century, lay scholars demanded evidence, not dogma. This mindset, born in the shadow of monastic corruption, paved the way for the scientific revolution. Figures like Copernicus and Galileo challenging church teachings echoed the 13th century scholars who raided abbey libraries. The monasteries' fall taught Europe that even sacred institutions could lie, a lesson that fueled modern ideas of critical inquiry and individual reason. Politically, the monasteries' collapse reshaped power. Their wealth and influence had made them rivals to kings, but their fall shifted authority to secular rulers. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of monasteries in 1536 wasn't just about faith, it was about power. By seizing monastic lands, he enriched the crown and weakened the church's political clout. Across Europe, kings and princes followed suit, reducing the church to a spiritual role rather than a feudal one. This laid the foundation for the modern nation-state, where secular law trumped divine authority. The idea of separation of church and state, so central today, has roots in the distrust sown by monastic corruption. The human cost was perhaps the deepest scar. The oblates, novices, and nuns who suffered abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, left no written records, but their pain echoed in the reforms that followed. The Council of Trent in the 1540s, responding to Reformation pressures, tightened rules for monasteries, banning forced vows, and limiting abbots' power. But for countless children sent to cloisters, for nuns trapped in convents, these reforms came too late. Their stories, buried in chronicles or whispered in villages, remind us that power unchecked harms the vulnerable most. A 14th century nun's letter, found in a convent archive, speaks of sisters broken by cruelty, a faint cry from a forgotten victim. Let's return to Brother Thomas, our monk at Cluny. The abbey is a shadow of its former glory, its monks dwindled, its granaries raided, its relics mocked. Thomas has seen it all, the gold that mocked poverty, the scandals that broke chastity, the burned books that hid truth. He's joined a small group of reformist monks, meeting in secret to dream of a purer church. But the world outside is moving faster. Peasants no longer tithe willingly, merchants fund lay churches, and scholars spread ideas once locked in abbey vaults. Thomas feels the weight of history shifting, his faith torn between the ideals he swore to and the reality he's witnessed. He pens a letter, hidden in a manuscript, calling for reform. It's a small act, but it joins a chorus of voices, peasants, scholars, mystics demanding change. This legacy of distrust had a darker side. The monastery's fall left a vacuum, filled by new powers, kings, merchants, reformers, who weren't always noble. The seizure of monastic lands enriched elites, often leaving peasants no better off. The Reformation, while breaking monastic power, sparked religious wars that killed thousands. The skepticism born of monastic corruption sometimes turned to cynicism, eroding faith not just in monks, but in all authority. A 15th century chronicler, John of Glastonbury, lamented that men trust neither God nor king, a sign of the chaos that followed. The monasteries' collapse freed Europe from one yoke, but it opened the door to new struggles. Yet there's a brighter legacy too. The fall of monasteries empowered individuals. Lay movements, like the Brethren of the Common Life, taught that faith didn't need monks. You could pray, read, and think for yourself. This idea, radical in 1400, is the root of modern individualism. The universities that challenged monastic control became engines of progress, their students driving the Renaissance and beyond. The distrust of unchecked power, born in the shadow of corrupt abbots, inspired ideas of accountability checks and balances, transparency, the right to question. These are the pillars of our world, built on the ruins of monastic empires. Let's pause and reflect. Have you ever seen an institution's fall reshape your world? Maybe a company's collapse exposed corruption, or a movement toppled a regime, leaving both progress and chaos. Share your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just medieval, it's human. How do we learn from the ruins of power to build something better? That's the question Brother Thomas's world faced, and it's the question we'll carry forward. The monastery's shadow stretches to our time, a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked. Their fall wasn't the end, it was a warning, etched in the stones of ruined abbeys. How do we heed that warning today in a world of new empires, corporations, governments, ideologies? What lessons can we draw to protect truth, faith, and the vulnerable? That's where we're headed next, as we close this journey with a reflection on the enduring lessons of the monasteries, dark history, and the vigilance needed to keep power in check. The monasteries' fall, a slow unraveling of greed, exploitation, and suppressed truth, left a legacy that reshaped faith, society, and power, casting a shadow that stretches to our own time. Their collapse wasn't just the end of an era, it was a warning, etched in the ruins of once mighty abbeys, about what happens when institutions betray the trust placed in them. How do the sins of medieval monks cloaked in piety, wielding unchecked power, echo in our world today? What lessons can we draw to guard against corruption in the systems we rely on? Welcome back to our final chapter in the dark secrets of medieval monasteries, where we're connecting the past to the present. If you're with us, drop a comment with where you're watching from: Tokyo, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely, and let's reflect on this cautionary tale together. If you've been gripped by this journey through history's shadows, hit that subscribe button to stay with us for more stories that uncover the truth. Picture a crumbling monastery in 1400, its walls scarred by time, its once grand halls silent but for the wind. The faithful no longer flock here, their trust broken by tales of gold-hoarding abbots, abused novices, and burned books. This ruin is more than stone, it's a symbol of what happens when power, cloaked in noble ideals, turns to betrayal. The monasteries promised salvation but delivered exploitation, their sacred vows twisted to serve greed. Their story, though centuries old, is a mirror for today, reflecting the dangers of unchecked institutions, be they governments, corporations, or even modern churches. As we stand amid these ruins, let us ask, what can the fall of the monastic empire teach us about the systems we trust, and how can we prevent their shadows from darkening our world? Let's start with the core lesson. Power without accountability breeds corruption. Monasteries thrive because they answered to no one but themselves. Abbots, shielded by papal exemptions, ruled like feudal lords, their wealth and influence unchecked. They hoarded gold while preaching poverty, silenced dissent with the vow of obedience, and controlled knowledge to keep the faithful in line. This wasn't unique to monks, it's a pattern we see today. Think of corporations that hide scandals behind PR campaigns, governments that suppress truth for control, or organizations that claim virtue while exploiting the vulnerable. The monastery's fall shows what happens when power grows too great. It rots from within, and the betrayed, whether peasants or modern citizens, eventually rise. Consider the vow of poverty, mocked by abbots who dined on venison while peasants starved. Today, we see parallels in leaders who champion equality but live in luxury, their wealth built on the labor of others. A 2025 report on global wealth inequality shows the top 1% own half the world's resources, echoing the monastery's grip on medieval land. Just as peasants paid tithes they couldn't afford, workers today face stagnant wages while executives earn millions. The lesson? Institutions that betray their stated values, whether a monk's vow or a company's mission, lose trust. When that trust breaks, as it did in the 14th century, rebellion follows, whether in riots or public outcry. The vow of chastity, broken in cloisters through scandals and abuse, offers another warning. Monasteries hid their sins to protect their image, silencing victims with threats or bribes. Today, we see this in institutions that cover up misconduct to save face. Recent scandals, corporations hiding environmental damage, organizations shielding abusers mirror the monks who buried nuns' cries to preserve their holiness. The #MeToo movement, ongoing in 2025, echoes the medieval whispers of abused novices, showing that silence only delays justice. The monastery's lesson is clear. Transparency is the antidote to corruption. When victims are heard, when secrets are exposed, power loses its shield. Obedience, the vow that bound monks to abbots, became a tool to crush dissent. Monks like Brother Thomas, who questioned greed, faced punishment, floggings, cells, excommunication. Today, whistleblowers face similar fates, demotion, lawsuits, or worse. In 2025, whistleblowers exposing corporate fraud or government surveillance often lose careers, even lives for speaking truth. The monastery's fall shows that silencing dissent protects the corrupt only temporarily. When peasants and scholars defied monks, their voices sparked change. Today, every tweet, every post, every protest amplifies those medieval murmurs, proving that truth, once spoken, can't be silenced forever. The monastery's war on knowledge, burning books, hoarding texts, reminds us how control over information sustains power. By locking away ideas, monks kept the faithful ignorant, their authority unquestioned. In 2025, we face similar battles. Misinformation spreads online, algorithms bury inconvenient truths, and governments censor to control narratives. The medieval loss of classical texts delayed progress for centuries. Today, suppressed data on climate, health, or inequality threatens our future. The lesson? Knowledge must be free, accessible, and shared. Just as universities broke monastic monopolies, today's open source movements and citizen journalists challenge modern gatekeepers, echoing the scholars who raided abbey libraries. The human cost of monastic corruption, oblates abused, nuns trapped, peasants exploited, teaches us to protect the vulnerable. Monasteries preyed on those with no voice, their suffering hidden behind sacred walls. Today, the powerless workers, minorities, children still face exploitation by systems that prioritize profit or power. In 2025, reports highlight labor abuses in global supply chains, from sweatshops to tech giants. The monastery's fall shows that ignoring the vulnerable breeds resentment, sparking revolts like those of 1381. Modern movements, labor unions, human rights campaigns carry that torch, demanding justice for those the system forgets. The monastery's collapse also warns of the fragility of empires. Their wealth and influence seemed eternal, yet plague, rebellion, and new ideas brought them down. Today, no institution is too big to fail. In 2025, we've seen corporate giants falter under public scrutiny. Governments topple from protests, and once trusted organizations crumble when their flaws are exposed. The medieval faithful, betrayed by monks, turn to lay movements and universities. Today, we turn to grassroots campaigns and digital platforms. The lesson? No power is invincible when trust erodes. Vigilance, questioning, exposing, demanding accountability keeps empires in check. Let's revisit Brother Thomas one last time, standing in Cluny's ruins. The abbey's grandeur is fading, its monks scattered, its relics mocked. Thomas, once a faithful monk, now sees the truth. The vows he swore were betrayed by those who swore them loudest. He's joined reformist monks, their secret meetings a flicker of hope. Outside, peasants build lay churches, scholars teach forbidden texts, and mystics preach a faith free of gold. Thomas pens a final letter, hidden in a manuscript, calling for a church that serves, not rules. His words, like those of countless others, join a rising tide that will soon flood Europe with the Reformation, washing away the old order. This story isn't just about monks, it's about us. Every institution we trust, governments, corporations, even communities, carries the same risk of corruption. The monastery's fall teaches us to watch for the signs, leaders who live better than they preach, systems that silence truth, structures that harm the weak. In 2025, we see these signs everywhere: CEOs dodging accountability, governments hiding data, organizations burying scandals. But we also see hope: activists exposing wrongs, journalists uncovering truths, citizens demanding change. The medieval faithful, from peasants to scholars, showed that no power is absolute when people speak out. Today, every comment, every share, every voice in the digital square echoes their defiance. So, what's the final lesson? Vigilance. The monasteries fell because their corruption was exposed, their power challenged by those they betrayed. We must do the same: question boldly, demand transparency, protect the vulnerable. In 2025, tools like X amplify our voices, letting us share stories, call out lies, and build movements. Just as medieval pamphlets spread dissent, today's posts and videos can spark change. But it starts with us, refusing to trust blindly, holding power to account. The monastery's ruins are a reminder: no empire, sacred or secular, is eternal when it betrays its purpose. Let's pause one last time. Have you ever questioned an institution you once trusted, a company, a government, a cause? Maybe you saw hypocrisy, exposed a lie, or fought for change. Share your story in the comments, because this isn't just history, it's our story. How do we keep power honest in a world where greed and secrecy still thrive? That's the challenge the monastery's fall leaves us, and it's one we face every day. As we close this journey, the monastery's legacy is a call to action. Their walls may be dust, but their lessons endure. Power corrupts, but truth endures. The faithful of the Middle Ages, peasants, scholars, monks like Brother Thomas, tore down a corrupt empire with their courage. Today, we carry their torch, watching, questioning, speaking. The story of the monasteries isn't over. It lives in every choice we make to hold power accountable, to seek truth, to protect the weak. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's shadows. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and let's keep exploring the truths that shape our world.